Ever found yourself wondering about those legendary parties, the kind people whisper about centuries later? You know, the ones whose sheer extravagance, maybe even scandal, just etch them into history. We're talking about the absolute wildest gatherings, and the figures who didn't just attend, but really defined the art of excess. So today our mission on the deep dive is to unroll some incredible historical scrolls, basically, and uncover exactly that. The most debauched parties and the party animals who were right there in the middle of it all. We've pulled together sources packed with details, specific historical figures known for revelry, iconic parties that are just legendary for being over the top. Okay, let's unpack this. We're about to take a shortcut, kind of, to being seriously well-informed on historical hedonism. From ancient orgies all the way to disco infernos.
It is striking, isn't it? How universal this theme of, revelry and excess really is. You see it across different eras, different cultures, sometimes it's political maneuvering, sometimes social display, or maybe just pure indulgence. It's this thread woven right through human history.
That's a really fascinating way to frame it. A thread through history. And speaking of ancient threads, where better to start than the ancient empires? Rome, especially. I mean, they kind of set a benchmark for debauchery, didn't they? Especially under figures like Emperor Nero. Our sources paint him as known for orgies, wild feasts, and setting the gold standard for Roman excess. We all know the legend, right? Him fiddling while Rome burned. But he definitely partied hard while it stood, no question.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And if Nero set that gold standard, you could argue his successor, Caligula, just blew past it. He essentially turned the imperial palace into like a 247 festival of mayhem and misrule. The account suggests that even the ancient Romans, who saw a lot, were scandalized by his behavior. And this raises a really important question, I think. What does it tell us about power when it's completely unchecked, when it's focused just on hedonism?
Yeah, that's deeply unsettling, isn't it? It sounds like this profound detachment from any kind of reality or responsibility. The ruler becomes the first victim of their own privilege, almost. But Roman revelry wasn't all just imperial madness, right? They had public stuff, too, like the Saturnalia. What was that about?
Right, Saturnalia was very different. It was a week-long public festival, kind of sanctioned period of role reversal, wild feasts, gift-giving, gambling, and temporary social chaos. It was this fascinating time when hierarchies were deliberately flipped upside down. Imagine masters serving dinner to their slaves, slaves gambling openly. It acted as a sort of social pressure release valve.
A pressure release valve. That makes a lot of sense. And during Saturnalia, the sources say slaves could party like their masters. That's a level of social upheaval you just don't see very often. But then on the other side of that very public, maybe even controlled chaos, you had the Bacchanalia. These were described as secret wine-fueled rites, reported to include orgies, mystical frenzy, and all manner of forbidden excess. Sounds different.
Oh, completely different. Significantly so. Saturnalia was about that temporary public inversion of order. The Bacchanalia, though, with its focus on mystical frenzy and forbidden elements, that was far more transgressive. These were essentially cultic rites, often secret, tapping into deeper, more primal urges that society usually kept suppressed. The contrast really highlights the complex layers of Roman life, control chaos for everyone. And then this unbridled, sometimes dangerous ecstasy for a few.
Wow, fascinating distinction. Okay, so while Rome had its emperors and rituals, let's jump across the Mediterranean. Another ruler was redefining opulence, but maybe as more of a political statement. Cleopatra VII, her lavish river parties with Mark Antony. I mean, the descriptions sound like pure fantasy. Floating palaces, rose petals everywhere, fountains of wine, perfumed air, and then there's that Nile banquet legend with the rumored pearls dissolved in wine. That just sounds bonkers.
It sounds bonkers, but it wasn't just insanity, it was highly calculated. If we connect this to the bigger picture, these events, like Cleopatra's, weren't just parties. They were acts of soft power, very shrewd. Dissolving a pearl in wine, that wasn't mere indulgence. It was a deliberate, almost contemptuous display of wealth you could just throw away. She was basically saying, my resources are so infinite, I can destroy a fortune on a whim. You can't compete, so you have to join me. It was pure power politics dressed up as a party.
Okay, so not just spending money, but a very clear message of dominance. Got it. Okay, from the Nile, let's jump forward quite a bit. Centuries forward, across to Europe, European royalty. This is where indulgence really became like an exquisite art form, right? King Louis XIV, Versailles. The sources call it a perpetual party palace. Just imagine. Masked balls, garden revels, nights that never seemed to end. Yeah, Louis XIV and later Marie Antoinette too, they really made indulgence a fine art with their famous fêtes galantes.
Absolutely. And this kind of royal partying wasn't just in France. Think about Catherine the Great over in Russia. Her court balls were apparently legendary for intrigue, flirtation, and abundance.
Yeah.
In these kinds of settings, diplomacy and, well, debauchery often went hand in hand. They were crucial stages for political maneuvering. Alliances made, rivalries played out, all amidst champagne and whispers. As much politics as pleasure.
So it's like high-stakes social theater. Makes sense. But it wasn't only the reigning monarchs who knew how to throw a significant party. What about Queen Christina of Sweden? After she abdicated, she moved to Rome and apparently hosted famously scandalous masquerades and intellectual salons. The sources say her parties blurred gender, politics, and pleasure. How did that work? Blending scandal with, like, actual intellectual stuff?
That's a really key point. For figures like Queen Christina, the scandal itself was often part of the statement. Her parties were deliberately designed as spaces where traditional norms, especially around gender behavior, were actively challenged, subverted. But within that provocative atmosphere, she attracted leading thinkers, artists, philosophers. The intellectual indulgence wasn't just a cover, it was woven into the fabric of the event. The edgy atmosphere actually encouraged more open discussion, pushing boundaries not just socially but intellectually too. So there were spaces for both genuine ideas and daring self-expression.
Ah, okay. That's a great way to put it, moving from just raw indulgence towards an excess of ideas, even if it was scandalous. And speaking of intellectual indulgence mixed with hedonism, let's shift to the literary libertines. And maybe some modern myth makers, people who really embodied that party animal spirit. Oscar Wilde, for instance, famous for his razor-sharp wit, sure, but also notorious for attending and hosting decadent parties in Victorian London's underbelly. He knew where the fun was.
And pushing those boundaries even further, you have someone like the Marquis de Sade. His libertine salons were infamous, places where, as the sources put it, the boundaries of society, morality, and storytelling were all tested and usually crossed. These were intensely provocative gatherings, meant to challenge accepted norms, explore darker human desires through action and through discourse.
Wow. Okay. Now, if anyone ever lived up to the phrase mad, bad, and dangerous to know, it has to be Lord Byron, right? His Venetian escapades alone are the stuff of poetic and probably very drunken legend. But maybe his most famous party story is that Villa Diodati summer back in 1816. That was the year without a summer, remember? Because of the Mount Tambora eruption, global cooling. So they were all cooped up in this Swiss villa. There were storms, laudanum, forbidden poetry, and goose stories. And not just any ghost stories. That session famously led to Mary Shelley writing Frankenstein. Talk about a productive, if weird, party.
That's such a perfect example, isn't it? How much of history's wildness is actual documented fact versus how much gets fueled by myth-making, by our desire for these scandalous larger-than-life stories. Think about Grigory Rasputin, the Mad Monk. The stories say he partied as hard as he preached, always surrounded by wine, women, and scandal. His life, whether every single detail is accurate or heavily embellished, became this incredibly powerful and lasting myth about indulgence, power, charisma.
Myths are powerful. And speaking of myth-making, let's jump right into the 20th century. Two really key modern myth examples here. First, Jay Gatsby's parties from The Great Gatsby. Okay, fictional, yes, but they perfectly captured the real vibe of the Prohibition era. That feeling of jazz, gin, dancing until sunrise, and not a care for tomorrow. Everyone wanted an invitation, blurring that line between guest and spectacle.
Absolutely nailed it. And then, maybe the ultimate modern mecca of debauchery, Studio 54. That brief, intense period from 77 to 80. It wasn't just a nightclub. It was a cultural earthquake. You had celebrities, drag queens, disco, mountains of drugs, and freedom with zero filter all crammed together. And that famous phrase really sums it up. What happened at Studio 54 stayed at Studio 54. It was this total escape from everyday constraints, a real explosion of expression and excess that just defined that moment.
These stories are just so captivating, the sheer indulgence. But sometimes that excess has a really dark side, a reminder of consequences. Think about the Ball of the Burning Men, Paris, 1393. It was a masquerade apparently so wild that the king's men wore tar and flax wild man costumes for a dance. Like flammable costumes, a torch got too close, set them ablaze. It ended up killing several guests, including nobles. Just a brutal case of excess meets tragedy.
Yeah, it's a chilling story. And if we connect that to the bigger picture, it's a stark reminder. While parties can be liberating, spaces for connection and expression, they absolutely carry risks. In their extremes, they can reveal the dangerous fragility of human behavior sometimes. It's such a sharp contrast to the sort of primal joy and chaos celebrated by figures like Bacchus or Dionysus, the original scroll slinger of debauchery, you could say. His very existence in mythology shows how deep this impulse to party, to seek excess, really runs in us.
It really does.
Yeah.
And what's so fascinating is how these tales, whether they're 100% historical fact or maybe embellished myths, they just stick with us. For centuries, they seem to tap into these universal desires, maybe universal taboos too. The chase for pleasure, blurring social lines, showing off power, and creating legends that just keep intriguing us. So what does all this mean for you listening in, who's just taken this pretty wild ride through history's most debauched moments? We've gone from Roman orgies all the way to the glittery floors of Studio 54. And what really stands out, I think, is this enduring human fascination with pushing boundaries, with indulging in excess. These deep dives show us not just what happened, but maybe why it still resonates, why these stories reflect our own desires, maybe even our own fears back at us.
And it really raises an important question for right now, doesn't it? In our own time, what are the modern equivalents? What are those spaces of sort of uninhibited revelry today? And what do they tell us about our current society, our values, our desires? Because while the specific forms of debauchery definitely change the clothes, the music, the substances, maybe that underlying human impulse, the impulse to seek escape or connection or maybe defiance through celebration, that seems absolutely constant. Perhaps it's a huge music festival now or an exclusive online community or a hidden club. That need for collective wildness seems to persist.
Absolutely, a constant need. We've really only just scratched the surface today of this whole human desire for celebration and maybe for transgression too. Keep exploring, keep questioning.